I'm not a fan of trigger warnings, but I will include one here as this is a particularly sensitive subject around which emotions are high. If trigger warnings meant anything, you'd be triggered by the warning itself, but nonetheless, I am going to discuss the recent events in London, street violence, rape, assault and sexual harassment here, so put on your big girl pants. I'm recording this while the Sarah Everard murder is fresh, and the man accused of the murder is in custody. The suspect is a police officer, and a vigil held to honour her death has been policed with a great deal of violence, in a way other protests during COVID haven't been cracked down upon. The tensions and emotions are running extremely high, which means that this is probably one of the worst times to try and introduce some moderation, nuance and consideration into the discussion, but that is also the most necessary time to do so. Bad decisions are made when they're made reflexively and emotionally. Some of the most dangerous words in the English language are "something must be done." I'm under no illusions that most people will listen to this in good faith, or that most will even pause to consider the content or to change their behaviour or demands, but some will, or at least might. Just as with the misinterpretations of my defence of free expression, people will willfully take this the wrong way, but such is life, and such is the internet. One has to be resigned to a degree of this. I consider myself to be an egalitarian, and I have a particular concern for men's issues. This is because I think that men's issues are woefully underrepresented in the national and international conversation, and as such, go unaddressed. Everything from male genital mutilation to the lack of shelter places for male victims of intimate partner violence, from men and boys falling behind in education to rates of depression and suicide. These concerns have led many to call me a men's rights activist, but while I do have friends within that movement who aren't the horror show that some call them, I've never considered myself such because I think that the men's rights movement has many of the same problems that alienate me from current feminism. However, I do think I can offer some insight into why men do get so bitter and angry and why they do join on to such groups, even those that mirror the petty nastiness of radical feminism. It's hypocrisy. It's betrayal. It's double standards. Like most of my generation, I was brought up to consider men and women equal, to decry sexism, to refuse to tolerate racism. The understanding was that we all have the same rights, and that the differences between us are meaningless compared to who we are as individual people. This was obviously and intuitively the right point of view, and for a while it seemed like we had these issues licked. Then something changed. I'd place the break point somewhere around 2010. Others suggest later. Gradually at first, picking up speed, the people who had been activists for equality and fairness began to express bigotry. This bigotry went largely unchallenged and even uncommented. People who had argued for the equality of the sexes began to spout the most hideously bigoted statements about men. People who had argued for racial equality started claiming that all white people were racist by dint of being born white, that they were inferior and blackness was superior. People who had fought hard for acceptance of their sexuality began spewing hatred at straight or cisgender people. If, like me, you took on board the messages of equality and fairness, this was a betrayal. This was bigotry. This was everything you'd helped to fight against and had eliminated from your personal worldview as much as you could. But now it was coming back at you from the people you'd helped and that you'd treated lifelong as equals. If you want to know where a lot of the anger and backlash comes from, that's it. Hypocrisy. Not living up to the standards we'd all agreed upon. Not to dismiss someone because of their identity category, but also not to elevate them, to try and eliminate our prejudice from any group against any group. Which brings us back round to recent events. We're being told that this singular event is an exemplar of society-wide problems, that women are afraid to be out at night, that this is male violence, that men are the problem and that women need to feel safe. Feelings aren't a good guide here, at all. They're far too subjective. We shouldn't care whether women feel safe, or at least it should be way down the list. We should care about whether they are safe. That's also somewhat subjective, but we can at least compare and assess against other degrees of risk and threat and use that as a benchmark for what to do. So, what do the statistics tell us? Women as a group are far less likely to suffer random street violence than men. Men suffer random street violence at a rate of generally around 150% that of women, though it's closer to 200% in more recent surveys. Men are also more likely to be injured or killed in such circumstances, while women are admittedly more likely to suffer sexual assault or rape. But all things considered, women are considerably safer than men and much less likely to be victimised. This isn't to minimise anything, these are just the bald facts. Now, unlike women, men don't seem concerned about this elevated level of risk relative to women. This leads us to ask which case is correct. Is it that men are not assessing their risk level appropriately and accurately, or is it that women are overestimating it? Why is society so much more concerned about violence against women than it is about more serious and prevalent violence against men? Why are women being told to carry things for self-defense while men and boys are being decried for doing the same, and this is being called out as a problem with knife crime? It is true that most, but by no means all, of this violence is carried out by men. We're hampered somewhat in accurate assessment because rape against men is commonly not recognised in law, and sexual assault against men is underreported when it comes to male victims. We also find that intimate partner violence is underreported against men, and may run as high as 33 to 40% of the total amount of intimate partner violence. We seem to have a paternalistic, benevolently sexist bias to see women as victims automatically, and to value their safety more than we do that of men. A classic example of this is a headline, shocked and appalled that 1 in 4 homeless people are women, blithely ignoring the fact that this meant 3 out of 4 were men, who would then, therefore, appear to need more assistance in that situation. Does any of this mean it's justifiable to treat all men as potential rapists and murderers? After all, they are more likely to be such, right? Well, no. Members of ethnic minorities are about twice as likely to be criminals as white majorities are, assuming UK-US. Would this justify clutching your purse whenever you pass a black man in the street? Of course not. We recognise rightly that this is a racist assumption. We recognise that there are many confounding factors at play, and that even if it's true, it's still a tiny minority. We understand that the vast and overwhelming majority of people of colour are not criminals. And we recognise that it would be racist to assume otherwise, that it is a microaggression to clasp your purse to your side, for example, or to cross the street, or to pick up the pace, all of these things which are also directed at men. So is it sexist prejudice to assume a predatory nature for men for exactly the same reason? Yes. Yet the excuses seen on the ostensibly left-wing feminist side of things sound exactly like the talking heads of the right excusing their racism. It's just acceptable to be sexist towards men in a way that it isn't acceptable to be racist. Some people will even claim you can't be sexist towards men, an ironically, profoundly sexist statement in and of itself. People will come out with anecdotes of their own sexual harassment and experience, but we can't make important societal or legal decisions on the basis of anecdote or feelings. We have to consider the facts. I have anecdotes of my own. I have been sexually harassed or assaulted several times, mostly by women, once by a man. Something I don't make a huge fuss about, or I laugh it off because nobody gives a shit or wants to talk about it because I'm a man. Even other men treat this as something funny or even boastful. I can't keep women off me or something. Should laws be changed and women given a 6 p.m. curfew because of my personal subjective experience? Obviously not. It's not most women who act in such a way, just as it's not most men who act in such a way. Should women be kept away from young infants, babies, because women have a statistically higher chance to commit infanticide than men? No, again, obviously not. The vast and overwhelming majority of women will not kill their children. So we can't operate on that basis of assumption. Which brings us back around to risk assessment. If men are even 3 times as likely, in some surveys, to suffer street violence of any sort from a random stranger, why are men so unconcerned about their safety when they're out and about, and why are women so fearful by comparison? Is it a constant diet of fear in the media and from activist circles, as happens with people who only watch Fox News or only read the Daily Mail? Is it that men are wildly underestimating their risk? What is it? What is it rational to be afraid of? Would you play Russian roulette for $1 million? What if the chance of getting a bullet was 1 in 100 rather than 1 in 6? Would you do it then? We have COVID as a good point of comparison here. From the start of the pandemic, you had about a 60% chance of contracting the disease and about a 2 to 3% chance of dying from it globally. Data on long COVID isn't that reliable yet, so globally we're looking at about a 1 to 1.5% fatality rate from the start of the pandemic. Less now. To deal with that threat, we've taken to wearing masks, social distancing and lockdowns. In comparison, a woman's chance of being a victim of random street violence is about 0.4% and a man's 1.4%. So what does a rational response to these levels of risk look like? I don't know. Correct and useful action can only follow from correct and useful information. We can't formulate meaningful policy or enact effective change until we look at these issues with dispassion and with rationality and distance. Meanwhile, a little consistency in ethics would go a long way towards creating solidarity and sympathy and unity to fix the problem. #NotAllMen is said sarcastically, but so many people seem to assume that it is #AllMen that it continues to need to be said that it isn't. And until we shy away from misandry with the same readiness that we do racism, we're not even going to have a chance of finding a solution.